The trade deadline is upon us, and we have some very exciting news here at Locked On Twins. Mr. Terry Ryan, the former GM of the Twins, will be joining us. We'll talk all things deadline, past and present. This is Locked On Twins.
You are Locked On Twins, your daily Minnesota Twins podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello again, and welcome back to Locked On Twins. I'm your host, Brandon Warren. You can unfollow me on the tweets at Brandon_WARNE, and we're going to roll through the intros and everything quickly because we have a very special guest. He's Mr. Dave Brown, not the special guest, but he's also on the screen. You can follow him on the tweets at AnswerDaveBrown. Dave, talk to him.
Been in the Baseball Writers Association since 2012. I've been a professional baseball writer of some kind since 1998, and we're very happy to have Terry Ryan here today.
Yes, of course. And just want to make sure you know that Locked On Twins is part of the Locked On Podcast Network, which is your team every day. We are appreciative of you being our first listen. Today's episode brought to you by Prize Picks, the easiest and most exciting way to play DFS. Go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnMLB and use code LockedOnMLB, all lowercase, for a first deposit match up to $100. Also, Twins, Mets, coming up here later this evening. If you're watching this on release day, it's a 6:10 p.m. first pitch. SWR, Simeon Woods Richardson against familiar face Jose Quintana, and it'll be Chris Atterbury, and I suspect maybe either Glenn Perkins or Danny on the call, but you can download SiriusXM. It's just the SXM app, search Twins. All right, we're through all that, and we are joined by my absolute favorite person that I've ever dealt with in the baseball business, Mr. Terry Ryan. How are you?
I'm doing good, Brandon. I appreciate those kind words.
Yes, of course. And I don't say that lightly. In fact, I put together a list, and so it's a very official thing, I must say. It is a fun time of year for a lot of reasons, but you were telling us off the air, and I knew this already, but you were filling us in, that you are back freshly from Cooperstown. What an experience that must have been to see the former number one overall pick, Joe Mauer, be rightfully, well-deservedly elected to the Hall of Fame.
Yeah, first ballot. That place is a great place to visit, even if you're not privy to seeing Joe get inducted. But he did a fantastic job on his acceptance speech, as did the three other guys. I know Jim Leland quite well, so it was a treat to see him give his speech as well. So if you ever have an opportunity to go to Cooperstown, I'd say you might want to do that if you're a baseball fan.
Well, and I was telling you the other day, and there's actually just kind of happenstance. I was watching, this is the kind of baseball dork that I am. I was watching an old Twins game. I shouldn't say old because 2001 isn't that long ago. But, I was watching a ball game. I didn't even realize the significance of it, but it was Twins and Cleveland. And they're going back and forth. It ends up being like an 11-10 game, fun season, 2001. But then they have Anthony LaPanta, who is then doing sideline stuff, talking to Dave St. Peter, and this little graphic pops up, and it says, possible selections for tomorrow's number one overall pick. And I thought, holy smokes, that's the Joe Mauer draft. And it said, Joe Mauer, DeJuan Brazelton, Mark Teixeira, Mark Pryor. What an interesting study in career trajectories, but I think it's fair to say that you guys made the right choice, and it turned out pretty good for you.
Yeah, we came down in the last week or so. We started zeroing in on Pryor and Mauer. Teixeira was in that mix, but he broke his ankle, so that put a little bit of a damper on his selection, but he had a fantastic career, so you couldn't go wrong with any of those three. And ultimately, we ended up selecting Joe, but it wasn't easy. I can tell you that we had a number of people in that room for the draft that particular night, and some people like Pryor, a lot of people like Joe, and we ended up taking Joe, and it was the correct choice.
Terry, was there anything about Joe being from the Twin Cities that gave you pause and said, well, maybe that isn't the greatest thing in the world to do, bringing in the hometown kid?
Yeah, you'd certainly take that into consideration because there's a lot of pressure on a hometown kid when you're selecting from the club that lives 7 miles from where he grew up. But I don't think Joe had enough exposure to all the sports, and certainly football and Bobby Bowden being in his home. And I think he could handle about anything that came his way. And that was a part of the reason we took him. We just thought he had the right demeanor. He was calm. He was talented. He was certainly versed in the Minnesota Twins history. So there were a lot of reasons we took him. And the most important reason, he was a gifted catcher, and he could do a lot of things with that bat. He could throw, he could run. I think he could command a staff. He certainly could catch and receive. So he was a full package, and we ended up benefiting from that for 15 years.
There's footage of him from the Prep Bowl in, I want to say 2000 and maybe even 1999, where you could really see the arm talent. I mean, he let the football fly. And so you knew of the athleticism there. And I know that wasn't your trade or business, but how good of a basketball player was Joe in your estimation? Because I feel like I've heard differing accounts of how far he could have gone in basketball besides as far as if he could have played at a high level college.
Well, first off, I was at that Prep Bowl game because I wanted to see him as a quarterback and see what he could do on the football field, which I think is somewhat important for multi-sport athletes. We believed in that. Then I went and watched him at Highland Park High School, and he matched up against Mo Hargrove. And I wanted to see him against a Division I basketball prospect. And Mo ended up going to the University of Minnesota. But I got to tell you that Joe was toe-to-toe with Hargrove, and I don't think there's any doubt in my mind. And I played a lot of basketball as a kid, and I everything that you wanted out of a basketball player, instincts, he had good angles, he had a good touch, he could jump, he played solid defense, he knew how to run an offense. So I think he was a Division I, and he could have played in the Big Ten, in my humble opinion, of that one game.
Now, I don't want to steal from Dave, and I don't want to steal from our point at large today, but do you have a favorite Joe Mauer story?
Oh, let's see. I guess, when I went into Elizabethton, Brennan, and he had signed, we sent him to Elizabethton, and you never wonder, or you're not positive about how things are going to transpire, but we had a pretty good idea he was going to flourish in the Elizabethton club and Appalachian League. And I went down there, and he was hitting 4 something, and I couldn't, that's hard to fathom out of a high school kid. And all of a sudden you go, and I left there, and I said, well, he's certainly good enough for this league. And I don't think there's any question he was going to be able to catch and throw. But I came back and I told people, this guy, I don't think the bat's going to be a question mark either. And as the summer progressed, he ended up hitting 400 for Elizabethton Twins. And that was pretty much the deciding factor for me that we got the right guy, and he's going to end up going through this system quite quickly. The other experience I had is when we did bring him up, he hurt his knee about that first game. And that's one of the problems with, you hate to see guys get hurt, and unfortunately he got hurt quickly, and there are a lot of question marks about his knee at that time, but he ended up overcoming that and going on to the Hall of Fame career.
I jump ahead a little bit here with Joe, Terry, but was there anything about the process of him getting into the Hall of Fame that surprised you a little bit? Did you think that it would, going back at some point, take more than one ballot to get him in?
I agree with what you're saying there, Dave. I thought he might. I was positive he was going to get in, but I wasn't sure about that first ballot. Mm-hmm. And the only reason you question it is he played more than half of his career at first base. And those types of numbers at first base are certainly different than what you would look at from Joe's catching experience. He's got all that hardware that you look for in a Hall of Famer, the All-Star and Silver Slugger and Gold Glove and all the batting titles. So he had a lot of the things, and probably most important on the first ballot decision, Joe Mauer was the most accessible guy you'd ever want to meet as a visiting media member or one of the national writers. That goes a long way. I'm not sure players understand the importance of being accessible and available to the people that are covering the game.
Yeah. It didn't seem, on that note, Brandon, it didn't seem like he enjoyed being asked questions about himself, and there was a humbleness to him and so forth. But it wasn't. You're right. It wasn't a case of him not being available to take a tough question if it need be or whatever. But he was always a a stand-up guy and a leader of the team in that sense as well. He took heat when he had to.
Yeah, that's correct. I admired the way he handled a lot of the negative aspects of going through a career, but he never hid. I mean, he was certainly guarded. There's no question. And he wasn't one of the guys that was always looking for the microphone. If somebody wanted to talk to him, he'd give you a somewhat honest answer if he could. You know, just like all of us that deal with media, you got to be guarded to some extent because you can't give them everything they are looking for. You try to give them as much as you can without dropping some things that are inappropriate.
Yeah, we're a bunch of jackals, aren't we? That accessibility too, I appreciated from you, Terry, sitting down eating ice cream with you at 6:30 before first pitch on a lot of nights. By the way, I'd always maintained that Joe could have played a lot of other positions in MLB in a hypothetical situation. Obviously, catcher and the value of the catcher and the value of a good catcher can't be understated. But how far up that defensive spectrum do you think he could have competed capably? Are we talking third base, right field? I mean, he played right field for one game, but that's a different story. How high could he have gone up that list, do you think, at least to start his career?
I think he could have played left field, right field, third base, first base, catch, and if you needed, he could have went over to second. I don't think you want a 6'5" second baseman over there, but I really do believe that he could have played second base. I think just center field and shortstop are the two places that probably wouldn't fit his skill set, but all those other spots, I think he would have flourished.
Well, I agree with that. I love that take. Let's take a quick pause. When we come back, it's going to be all trade deadline because we are coming up to it. In fact, as we're recording, Justin Turner getting traded to the Mariners. So there's a lot of things going on. We're not exactly breaking news because the show won't air as we're talking, but we're going to keep the trade deadline going, and we'll be right back. Of course, we do got to give some love to SupplyHouse. It's the site that is made for skilled trades. It's SupplyHouse.com. It is the reliable way to order plumbing, HVAC, and electrical products online, and their easy-to-use website is packed with helpful resources and the latest product info to help you get the job done right. Shop a complete inventory of over 200,000 parts from over 400 top brands and get your order delivered right to your door with fast shipping from coast to coast. If you need help with an order, you can get expert support and industry-leading service from the friendliest folks in the game and talk to a real person every single time. And if you're a pro in the skilled trades, you can get a competitive edge, easy for me to say, by joining SupplyHouse.com's free Trade Master program at SupplyHouse.com/TM. What does that entail? Well, every Trade Master gets access to a dedicated phone line, free shipping, and discounts on every order. So join the over thousands of trade pros already in existence benefiting from the free membership at SupplyHouse. Again, that's SupplyHouse.com/TM and order plumbing, HVAC, and electrical supplies from anywhere with just a few clicks at SupplyHouse.com. All right, we're back here with former Twins GM Terry Ryan. Terry, what's keeping you busy these days?
Well, I have grandchildren. I have a wife that has plenty of things for me to do. I'm traveling a little bit, but not too much. I've had my share of travel throughout my career, so I'm trying to not do much of that. But I'm on the board of BAT, which is the baseball assistance team, too, which is very gratifying to see that we're helping people that are down in their luck. But I'm certainly busy enough, Brandon. I'm not. I've tried to improve my golf game. That's not going well.
Well, there are a lot of aspects of the trade deadline that I'd like to ask you about. I assume Dave too. And, you know, we won't get terribly specific unless that's something you're into. But how are your sleep patterns altered around the deadline in the days when you were answering and making phone calls? Was it a drastically different thing, or was it kind of, business as usual plus a little bit more?
No, that's not the way it is. When you get into the month of July, you're always thinking about what you might do during the trade deadline. So by this time, obviously, you're coming to a close here, and people are scrambling a little bit if they haven't got done what they're planning on trying to accomplish. But back in early July, you're contacting the other 29 clubs' general managers or their assistants, and you're trying to get a feel if you got any match whatsoever. And if you've got matches with 10 clubs or so, then you start zeroing in on those 10 clubs. And ultimately, you're thinking you're probably going to get something done maybe the day or 2 days before the trade deadline. But we made some trades right up to the last 2, 3, 4 minutes of the trade deadline, and that's a very possible situation. But you don't like to see it get that deep into the calendar or the clock. But everybody's trying to do something. If you're a seller, you're trying to end up maximizing what you've got on your roster and probably going for prospects. And if you're a buyer, you're looking for immediate gratification, and you're hoping you have a deep farm system to get the job done and get somebody in on your club that can help you immediately.
Why does it take so long to get deals consummated? I mean, needs are pretty well known by early in July, and now with the expanded playoffs, teams are, they're waiting a little longer because they don't know, are they in, are they out, or that sort of thing. But is there not urgency earlier on? Does it take more time, like more of a urgency situation as far as time to be like, okay, this prospect is available, or we're willing to do this money-wise? Why does it ramp up as quickly as it does? Because I feel like, in my mind, your needs are pretty well understood by the All-Star break.
You're always trying to get a better deal. So you hold off, and you keep holding off, and you're waiting for somebody to crack. And you want this hotshot prospect, and they won't give him up. And the closer you get to that deadline, maybe the more opportunity it is to free that player up. So that's, people wait and wait and wait as long as they can until you see that this isn't going to be a possibility, and then you move on to the next club. But every GM's always trying to get the best deal on the table. And some people will pull that deal off the table, which is frustrating, and then all of a sudden you're stuck with nothing.
Who is your favorite person to deal with, regardless of whether you consummated a trade with or not?
Well, I had some luck with various GMs. Dombrowski's a good man to deal with because when he puts his mind to it, he's going to make a trade, as he did here recently. Yep. Billy Bean was always a guy that I liked dealing with. Steve Phillips was a guy that was always prepared. So was Brian Cashman. Anthopoulos, John Sherholz. I could go way back to John Sherholz, and he was always ready, and he always was intent on getting something done. Jim Bowden was always famous for sending midnight texts on some kind of idea, and Jim was very aggressive. Mm-hmm. He knew what he wanted to get done, and he wasn't going to stop until he finalized some kind of trade. I didn't have enemies out there per se. I know I had a reputation of being tough to deal with because I didn't like to give up prospects because we were always a little bit more of a payroll-oriented club back in the Metrodome days. We had a strict budget, and I just didn't want to give away the talent that I knew I could afford in the near future. But I think my reputation, I was a little tough to deal with because I wouldn't give up prospects.
Kind of on that note, do you think that can you guess, are Falvey and Levine, are they in a similar spot right here? Do you think that they're going to make a pretty big deal in these next 24 hours, or do you have any clue about that?
I don't have the biggest clue about it because I'm not in that room with them, but I do believe they're going to go get a starting pitcher. They've got a reputation of going and getting what they think they need, and that reputation served them fairly well. Some of them haven't worked out. We all know that. We all don't make trades that work out every time you make the deal, but those two guys are aggressive, and they know what they need, and they know what they want, and they usually have enough in their farm system to be able to go get it.
Yeah, it's a nice luxury to have when you can draft and develop guys who become valuable not only to you but in trades. One thing I've always wondered is, you always think of like, oh, a team could say, hey, someone else just jumped in and they offered us more. Well, you can call that bluff, and at that point, maybe that GM has egg on their face. How hard is it to smoke that kind of stuff out of, or is it basically a lot of guys dealing on the up and up where you can kind of know that nobody's going to really mess with you that way?
Yeah, I've had that go both ways, Brendan. I've had people that flat out fibbed.
Yep.
And I've had people that when they said it, you knew they meant it because that's their history and the reputation. And most of us, the 30 GMs, we know each other quite well. And we all kind of grew up in the game together, whether it's a farm director, a scouting director, or assistant GM. And you know there are people in the game that you can trust, and there are people in the game that you have to consider whether or not this is true or not. My favorite statement coming from a GM that I dealt with, he always had to say, I got to go talk to my owner. Well, I know that we're down the road so far. I know that isn't accurate. You don't need to talk to your owner on this deal. This isn't even a major deal. If you got to talk to your owner, I'm talking to the wrong guy.
Mm-hmm.
I was looking at some of your, this isn't a trade deadline thing, but it struck me. In 2012, you had come back. I think it was maybe your second year back. I don't know if it was your first draft or your second draft back. And you guys got Buxton and Barrios right out of the box. How did that transform things when you hit on picks like that? Transform everything else?
Yeah, that was my first year back. The Buxton thing was basically a no-brainer. When Correa had been picked first, and then Buxton came along. The Barrios thing was our scouting people. They identified him. He's very athletic, and he had a high ceiling. He hadn't pitched a whole bunch. He was a shortstop in high school. But our scouting department, and the GM gets credit for the draft, Dave, and the GM gets criticized for the draft. And I would say about 90% of the time, it's the scouting department, the scouting director, the supervisors, the cross-checkers. They do all the work, and the GM takes all the credit. And I want to make sure that Darren Johnson was a scouting director at that time, if I'm not mistaken, in both Barrios and Buxton. And they did a nice job. I just compliment them. I did see Buxton in high school. I traveled to Georgia to see Byron. You know, he was a man amongst young men, is what he was. He's probably the fastest player I've seen, and he could do everything on the diamond. It wasn't all that tough to be able to select him. And if we didn't take him, the next club probably would have, he would have not got out of the top 5 for sure.
Yeah, I always have thought Buxton is probably the most athletically gifted twin I've ever seen. Obviously, there's been great athletes, there's been great players, there's been great all that. But as far as that Barrios pick, I was positive, and not because I'm a smart person, but because I'm actually just kind of dumb. I thought you guys were going to take Mitch Brown with that pick.
Well, I saw Mitch Brown a lot. You talking about the kid down in Rochester?
Yep.
Yeah, I saw him a couple times, and I didn't think at that time that he was up in that neighborhood, but he was certainly a draft up in the top 5 rounds, and I think he did go up in there somewhere.
Well, I think he was like not that far after in Cleveland, so it wasn't. Yeah, he was. I mean, on the big boards, he was right around there. So and then when you guys take this kid Barrios, and I'm like, oh, skinny kid from is Puerto Rico, and hey, panned out pretty dang good. He's still going and got himself a $100 million contract, and good for him, good for you guys.
Yeah, I see he spun one up there yesterday, so he's doing well for Toronto.
Yes,
and he had a lot of intensity in his personality. He knew he was good, and he went out there and did it. And for the most part, he stayed healthy and still has been healthy. Those are the types of guys you like to pick and put out there every 5 days. Starting pitching is a tough commodity.
Yeah, it sure is. There's no doubt about that. Let's take our break here, and then when we come back, it'll be more trade deadline talk. Again, we're joined by former Twins GM Terry Ryan. Absolutely delighted about that. But again, quick break. Got to give our best regards and some love to Prize Picks. It's America's #1 daily fantasy sports app with over 5 million active members. It's the easiest and most exciting way to play DFS because unlike other apps, you're not nudging out all those other guys who are playing 50 lineups in a 100 lineup contest or using their funky algorithms to nudge you out. It's just you picking more than or less than on all kinds of different player stat projections and watching the winnings roll in. You can go risky, you can go risk averse, and it adjusts your multipliers. So you can go from $10 to $1,000. If you go super risky, you can go from $10 to $35, $40, $50. There's all kinds of options. You really got to just check it out for yourself. All kinds of different sports coming up here. Right now we're MLB and then the Olympics, but we'll get the WNBA back soon. NFL's coming up. We're in training camp mode right now. All kinds of different options. Prize Picks available in over 30 states. So check out if they are in yours. Download the Prize Picks app today and use the code LOCKEDONMLB. You'll get a first deposit match up to $100. That's the code LOCKEDONMLB, all one word, and it's on Prize Picks. You'll get a deposit match up to $100. Pick more, pick less. It's that easy.
Locked On Twins today, we have a very special guest, Terry Ryan, and we're asking him about his own history and the trade deadline. And one thing we've kind of hinted at how finances, shape how teams make moves, not just the Twins, but any team. When you were GM of the Twins, they had you guys kind of had your own venture with TV and a local TV channel, and the Twins are kind of in a situation here where they're kind of in between the Valley Sports era and maybe the next era, and it's obviously having some kind of effect on how the front office operates. I don't know how much. I mean, the buck stops with you, but what was that like having to deal with a new station that was just like Twins programming or primarily Twins programming, and that is like a form of revenue, and how that all factored into you doing your regular job as player acquisitions?
Yeah, Dave, in a baseball front office, you got the business side and you got the baseball side, and you have to coexist. But we never let that affect what we were trying to do on the baseball side. I don't ever remember them talking about the TV revenue or how much we're getting from this station or how it's going to affect us. I mean, we changed radio stations a couple of times as well, but it never came into, oh, here's your payroll because of our TV agreement or radio agreement. Back in those days is a heck of a lot different, but I don't know. The business side was very cooperative with the baseball side in my tenure, and I've always been grateful for that because it can get a little complicated sometimes. It's kind of like when you have dissension in your scouting department and your player development partner. They disagree or they don't take accountability, and that's something that you got to nip if you're a general manager. You got to get rid of that attitude.
Mm-hmm. Do you have a guesstimate on average number of calls you took and made or combined on a deadline day in a given year?
Some years more than others, but it's, I guess if you start in mid to early July, you're going to have calls daily. So you're either making them or you're receiving them, or your assistants who, there's a lot of friends in the game below the GM chair, and they'll reach out much more frequently to their friends than they would to call directly to a GM. So a lot of people in the organization, you might have 8, 9, 10 people in that office the last week of the trade deadline, and you're going to tap into the expertise to all the people that are around you. Plus you're having each of those guys call their buddies up with the clubs that you're trying to do something with to see exactly where they're at.
What does the anatomy of an intensifying negotiation look like? I mean, again, there's going to be ramping up last minute deals. There's going to be ones you talk about for a month, but I mean, the anatomy of it, like, how does it ebb and flow?
Well, you want to get something done, so you're probably going to have to bend a little bit. You want each side to be somewhat happy, or you're not going to get anything done. But then you got, all right, here's what we're going to do. Let's talk about the player to be named later to solidify this trade, or let's talk about cash to solidify the trade. Mm-hmm. Or let's wait a minute. I don't know about this guy's medical. We got to have medical reports from you before we're going to sign off on this deal. So that's another issue. You got to have your doctors are available. So when they send the medical reports over, you shift them to the doctor or whoever is your main medical guy, and have them sign off before you'll do anything. So that's the problem. We'll wait until the last day. There's too many things to accomplish. Then you have to get the whole deal in the commissioner's office's hands so they can sign off on it.
Terry, you kind of talked us through this a little bit. With most trade negotiations, I would imagine it's you and your counterpart, and then maybe your assistants and their counterparts. Were there some teams that brought in like a fleet of guys to try and negotiate with? Did it ever get complicated like that?
Well, back in the days, we didn't have as many analysts, Dave, so But nowadays, you're going to have your analytical department involved in this very much. And sometimes the owner will be in there if it's a very huge financial burden for either club. So there will be all kinds of people that flow in and out of that office. And you have your farm director around, and you're going to have your scouting director around. Because if you trade a prospect, you're hoping that your scouting director and farm director will chime in. Listen, there's nobody that I would trade for this guy that we're giving them. So you got to be careful as a GM. It's easy for a GM to trade prospects, but it hurts the farmer and scouting directors so bad that I always wanted to know what they felt about that player, because I didn't want to trade a guy that they thought had a ceiling of an all-star.
And you mentioned other GMs that say things like, well, I got to go talk to my owner. Don't you guys have those conversations a lot ahead of time anyway? So you go into the negotiations sort of knowing what your latitude is as far as what you can do as far as the owner goes?
Yeah, that would be correct. You'd think that you'd already talked to the owner. That's kind of a stall tactic. But if you get into the last day or so, sometimes a big deal will come upon your desk and you say, holy crap, there's a lot of dollars, or there's a lot of prospects, or there's a lot of talent going the other way. And you don't want to blindside your owner for sure, because they don't want to be embarrassed. They should know what's going on.
Do you estimate that we can talk about in general, and then for completed trades, did you initiate more trades?
You still with me, Brendan?
Yeah, he's frozen on my end too.
Frozen. Yeah, I'll answer that.
Yeah,
I probably took more calls than I initiated, because, for my first 7-8 years, we struggled. So I was always in a sell mode, obviously, with our record and where we were in the standings. And once we got better in about 2001, we kind of turned the corner. Those are the days what we were looking to add almost every year there for, 8-9 years. So depending on my years of tenure there, the first part, we were trying to get prospects. And in my last part, we were trying to get major league talent.
Were you more comfortable doing one or the other, trying to get better for tomorrow or add for the pennant run?
I was feeling a heck of a lot better than going for the pennant run than I was worried about getting prospects. I don't think there's any question. Maybe the best acquisition we made was Shannon Stewart. We did that around the All-Star break. It wasn't a trade deadline, but it was going into the situation. We had lost like 12 or 13 games straight, but we had a good club. We were just in a funk. And we traded Bobby Kelty for Shannon Stewart straight up, and then he jump-started us again and got us into postseason.
Yeah, Kelty was a nice player too. He had his limitations, but he could hit left-handed pitching. Now, for a second, I lost you there. So I want to get back to the beginning of if you thought you started or initiated or received more calls, because I think I may have lost the first part when I kind of had a blip on the radar.
Yeah, in the 90s, Brandon, I would take more calls because people are looking to get our veterans and people that could help. And then when we got into the 2000s, when we got pretty good and we were trying to add all the time, I would have been initiating the calls because we're looking to add.
How different was the job in the Metrodome era versus Target Field?
It was different, obviously, going to the ballpark and Target Field. What a beautiful ballpark that is and was, certainly compared to the Metrodome. But I don't have any complaints about that Metrodome. It treated the Minnesota Twins well. We won 2 World Series there. We won some, obviously, we could put together a pretty good roster. We had payroll concerns. We weren't drawing 2 million people or anything for a while until 91 when we drew 3. So that was great. But I was an outdoor ballpark guy. I didn't like artificial turf. I didn't like playing Sunday afternoons in the Dome when it's 80 degrees out. But for the most part, it did serve its purpose, and we got done what we needed to in the Metrodome, and the move to Target Field was ideal. And I'm very appreciative of being in both those ballparks.
You ever see, though, the rainouts these days and go, gosh, we had that covered?
I don't ever feel like that, Dave.
Oh.
You know, I've spent a lot of time in that Metrodome, and it's convenient. And it's convenient for the people coming from the Dakotas and outstate and Iowa and Wisconsin. Yep, I understand that. I've seen a lot of games in Milwaukee, and they've got the same situation. It's a little different situation. They play on grass down there and stuff like that. And, you know, they can open up that ceiling there, but it's an ideal place to scout because, you know, you're always going to see a game and you're always going to see pregame. I know it's important. I love the ability to see batting practice and infield when they had it, and you could always count on that in the Metrodome or down there at American Family Life Stadium.
What's something fans might not know about the deadline as far as logistics? I mean, I wrote a story actually. It was 20. I don't know if it was 18 or it was the year that Dozier got shipped out. So it must have been with. I talked to Mike Herman about the logistics of like players being traded and shipping their cars and all the basically how their lives are turned upside down in the span of about 2 seconds. But is there anything fans might not know that you think would be interesting?
Let's go back to Escobar when we acquired him from the White Sox for Liriano. Number one, he didn't speak English. Two, he was playing on their major league team, and I'm going to ship him to Rochester. Three, his wife was pregnant. Four, he didn't have much interest, I don't think, in going to Rochester. So there were a lot of complications. You know, I had to find somebody, and I did. There was a person in our office that was bilingual and spoke Spanish. So the first thing I had to say to him, listen, Eddie, we're not bringing you to Minnesota. We're sending you to Rochester in AAA because he needed to play. So that was an awkward trade, although it was one that I thought was okay. You know, and we did fine. He turned out to be a pretty good player for us. But, you know, you got to get the medicals, obviously, and then you got to get not only the player moved, but you got to help with his family getting moved. And there's all kinds of things that have to. And Mike Herman, the travel director for the Twins, was good at it. He's experienced at it, and he knew how to get things done. But it's a complicated thing, and sometimes the player can't get there for about 4 days. So, you know, it's just not. Yeah, you're not with the White Sox. You're with the Twins. We'll see you tomorrow. It's not that easy.
I have to give you credit. But what an incredible personality and just one of my favorite people. That list I mentioned, I have Escobar high on that list. Just a fun guy to be around. I have to give you credit, though. You and I were having a back and forth. I think it was probably during one of those scrums where I said something about Escobar being a really good utility player. And you looked me right in the eye and said, that's a future everyday player. And I remember thinking, what am I missing here? I'll tell you what, probably quite a bit since he went out and was an everyday player for about, 4, 5, 6 years there on the outside looking into the league right now. But the league needs more Eduardo Escobars, and I definitely got set straight that day.
Well, let me follow up on that, Brandon, because Billy Milos was the scout that was covering the White Sox, and he sat on them for quite a long time because we were in depth on – they wanted Liriano pretty bad, and we were in a sell mode at that time. And he had told me that this guy can play. He wasn't playing much for Chicago.
Right.
But we had a little look at him in the Arizona Fall League, I think the previous year or two. And he was plenty good out there. And usually if they're everyday look in Arizona in the Fall League, they probably have a chance. Now, he was just a kid with the White Sox. I think he was about 21. So there was room to grow. And Bill Milos told me there's no doubt in his mind that he's going to be an everyday player. And he saw him play about a dozen times.
There was one more question I wanted to ask you about Joe Mauer, Terry, and it's related to the future. I had a chance to talk to him on a media panel before his Hall speech, and he said he's definitely interested someday when the kids are a little bit older, and he doesn't know what role it would be, but in coaching, maybe in the majors, maybe professionally, whatever. How do you see that playing out for him? What would be why would he be good at it if that's what he wanted to do?
Yeah, he reminds me a lot of players that retire, Dave, because they've got young kids for the most part, and you put your wives through heck because you're gone all the time for 15 years. So now is the time for him to be home with those 3 kids and be home with his wife to help. and he can coach or manage down the line if that would be his desire. Now, his brother Jake went through it. He was a good manager in the minor leagues, and fortunately his wife got him back, and now he's in business. But he was a good manager, but he went back to his wife and his kids because they needed him. Now, Joe can wait another 5-10 years or whatever he chooses, but he's knowledgeable. He's got leadership. He's intelligent. He's got baseball blood. He's been around athletics his whole life. He knows what it's like to be a multi-position player. He knows the grind. I mean, there are a lot of players out there that I think could be in coaching or managing, but they have children and they have a wife. And sometimes you have to sacrifice and take a father and a husband and that approach over a baseball job again. So he certainly doesn't need the money or anything. So I suspect at some point, Joe might be back in uniform and manage or coach.
Yeah, and he's still going to have the cachet in the game with his name. It always shocks me when guys who made as much money as they do stay in the game like that. Carlos Beltran getting, he managed the Mets for about a half hour. As far as Mauer's last game and catching again, when or how did you observe that? Because I was in the press box and I remember just getting kind of chills, but how did you take that in?
I was in Fort Myers and I heard that game on the radio somehow. I don't know how or why, but then I heard all the things that are taking place, and it was an unbelievable finish to his career, and I was very happy for him. I didn't realize that he was going to retire, Brandon, or I would have been there, I'm sure, but all of a sudden I'm listening, and this is going to be his last game, and then he puts on the catching gear, and they set it up with the opposition, and it couldn't have been a better ending.
Yeah, it was his last game, Matt Belisle pitching's last game, and I don't remember if I think Jimenez continued playing, but it was a few other guys' last games. I do want to bring us back full circle to the trade deadline before we wrap things up. What was the most last minute deal you can remember consummating?
Let's see. I think one of those Aguilera trades was a last minute thing because he switched dugouts.
95 in Boston?
Probably so. Yeah. And the other one was Mitkevich, and he switched dugouts in the Metrodome. So those were both done within 3 minutes of the trade deadline.
Oh, wow. That's incredible. This is the last one I have. Dave's going to wrap up with one, and then we'll let you go. Are there any trades you didn't make that kind of stick in your mind or keep you up at night?
Well, there's one that I released a player that's stuck in my mind. If you're alluding to something like that, he wasn't a trade. I just made a mistake.
Yep.
But I think there probably is. There are some trades that you look back, but I don't think I had one of those whoppers where I'd say, "Boy, I wish I would have made that." I don't remember one of those. So, I released David Ortiz, and that was a huge mistake, and that's something that eats at me almost not daily, but certainly often. So, I just flat out blew it. And then, I don't know, that didn't scare me off though. We made trades after that and releases after that and acquisitions. And you can't be afraid to be a general manager, or you're never going to get anything done, or you certainly won't have much success. And, we went into the Asian market and it didn't work out when we went and got Park. Well, it didn't work out, but we're not afraid to go back over there. Mm-hmm. So you got to keep at it, and you got to try again, and you hope that you better make a better decision.
Terry, I wanted to know, this doesn't have anything to do with the deadline, but like before you became a front office guy, you were a scout. You came up as a scout. You were with the Mets from like 1980 to 85 or 6. What do you remember about how that team went from kind of to a world champion and one of the best teams of the 80s, and what was your part in it?
Well, I started there in 80 as an area scout in the Midwest, and I signed Greg Olson out of the University of Minnesota, which was one of my better signs, and he ended up in the big leagues for quite a few years. But at the time, the Mets were horrible, Dave. In 1980, we were bad, and the first pick of the draft was Strawberry. Then the next year or two, we got Gooden, and we started getting Dykstra and Aguilera and all these guys over there. Frank Cashin was a great GM, in my humble opinion. I learned a lot from him. I was around him some. Pete Gabriel was a scouting director and gave me my first job over there. And I spent 5 good years with the Mets, and Andy McPhail came calling, and I was very appreciative of that. But the New York Mets came from zero, and then they got Gary Carter, and they signed Keith Hernandez, and then they started adding, and they made a trade for Ed Lynch and some of those guys, so they got some starting pitching. But I thought Frank Cashin was one of the best general managers I've ever been around.
Wow, incredible. Well, that's all I have, Dave. I think the same for you. And so, Terry, thank you so much from the bottom of my heart that you were able to take time out for us. Just wonderful, wonderful stuff. He's Dave Brown. I'm Brandon Warren. Thank you again so much, Terry, for coming on. And hopefully someday again, our paths can cross, or we can have you back on again to talk shop.
Thanks for having me, guys.
You got it. That is Terry Ryan. This has been Locked On Twins, and we'll see ya tomorrow night.
Right.